All right, let's just jump right in. Picture this. You're in charge of securing a nation's borders, right? And you sign off on a staggering RM 9.14 billion in federal funds. Literally billion with a B. It's a massive, massive injection of capital, all meant to build up a cutting-edge maritime defense fleet. You sign the paperwork, the funds go out, and you sit back and wait for those ships to roll in.
But, and this is the entire crux of our explainer today, 0 ships were delivered. None. After paying out over $6 billion, the result was just empty water. No ships whatsoever. And look, this isn't just some administrative oopsie or clerical error. It is a profound systemic breakdown. So today we are going full forensic investigator to figure out exactly how these systems of accountability just collapse.
Welcome to The Explainer. I am so pumped to walk you through this. We're doing a data-driven institutional autopsy based on the newly declassified Sabah Federal Financial Integrity Report 2026. And just to be clear, we're strictly looking at the hard data, the court rulings, and the forensic accounting here. We aren't taking political sides, we're just unpacking the source material to understand the actual structural mechanics of Malaysia's federal setup, specifically when it comes to the state of Sabah.
Here's our dossier for today. First, we'll map out the architecture of loss. Then, Sabah's 40% entitlement. Third, demographics and security. After that, we crack open the procurement fraud playbook. And finally, we'll look at rebuilding transparency. Let's get to it.
Section 1, the architecture of loss, systemic financial asymmetry.
So, Malaysia's government-linked companies, or GLCs, control a war chest exceeding 1 trillion ringgit. Trillion! But how does value actually leak out of an ecosystem that massive? Well, the report uses a really specific term, legalized siphoning, and we need to be super precise here. We're not necessarily talking about straight-up Hollywood-style criminal theft. It's more about extracting public value through mechanisms that technically clear legal hurdles, but expose incredibly weak accountability. Basically, it's capital flying out the door way faster than oversight can catch up.
Take a look at Khazanah and PNB, for instance. They poured $47 million into Fashion Valet, only to walk away with a 93% loss. Ouch, right? Meanwhile, KWAP pumped over $163 million into this Indonesian agritech startup called eFishery. The result? A total write-off after a massive accounting fraud came to light. The real takeaway here isn't just the individual failures, it's the pattern. We keep seeing these fast-moving private market deals where they're throwing money around way faster than they're doing basic independent due diligence.
And you know, the institutional disconnect gets even crazier. Look at the declassified inquiry into Lembaga Tabung Haji. Back in 2017, they reported a RM 3.4 billion profit. Sounds great, right? Well, the audited reality was actually a net loss of about RM 1.4 billion. Literally a $1 billion swing. How? They were counting unrealized asset values instead of cold, hard audited reality. And the absolute kicker? Millions in bonuses were still paid out during those deficit years. Guess who absorbs those losses? The public balance sheet, eventually bailed out by a government special purpose vehicle.
Now, you might be sitting there wondering, okay, what does missing capital in Kuala Lumpur have to do with Sabah's borders? Well, it's all deeply connected. When federal funds leak out through inflated contracts or these crazy venture capital write-offs, it directly guts the budget meant for national readiness, local infrastructure, and, crucially, honoring constitutional financial agreements with states like Sabah, which actually brings us right to our next chapter.
Section 2, Sabah's 40% entitlement, the lost years.
This 40% entitlement is pretty much the constitutional cornerstone of Sabah's financial rights, baked right into the 1963 Malaysia Agreement. Let's actually look at the math in Article 112C of the Federal Constitution, because it's pretty straightforward. Step 1, you take the current federal revenue pulled from Sabah, subtract the revenue already assigned to the state, and you get your current net revenue. Step 2, look at the baseline net revenue from back in 1963. Step 3, Sabah gets exactly 40% of the difference. See, it's a mathematical formula. It's a statutory right, not just some discretionary gift the federal government can choose to hand up.
But here is the catch. The Constitution also mandated that this formula be reviewed every 5 years. And, spoiler alert, that didn't happen. In October 2025, the High Court actually ruled that the federal government unlawfully completely failed to do this mandatory review for 48 years, from 1974 all the way to 2021. The court literally dubbed this massive gap the lost years. Following that, the federal government filed a limited appeal. They aren't fighting the 40% rule itself, but they're pushing back on the court, calling it an abuse of power. So as of April 2026, there's a stay of execution, hitting pause on the actual payment timeline.
So, where does the bank account stand today? The Prime Minister estimates the federal government pulls in about RM 10 billion annually from Saba, and they've handed over an interim allocation of RM 1.5 billion while the court appeal plays out. But here is the elephant in the room. We have an utter lack of published, verifiable, year-by-year revenue data from 1963 to today. Without that transparent historical data, trying to calculate exactly what is owed for all those lost years is basically impossible.
Section 3, Demographics and Border Security, an institutional lapse. All right, let's pivot and look at the human element of this border administration. If we look at the district of Kinabatangan, Department of Statistics numbers for 2025 paint a really stark picture. Non-citizens make up 72.9% of the population. Now remember point 6 of the 20-point agreement? Sabah was supposed to keep control over its own immigration. What this demographic shift actually represents is decades of federal administration failure, including the whole historical Project IC era, where identity documents were allegedly handed out to foreign nationals on a massive scale.
I do want to pause right here, though, because this quote from the report is absolutely vital to keep our perspective objective. The demographic shift is, quote, a question about the adequacy of federal administration, not a claim about the character or intentions of the resident population itself. We have to be clear, we're analyzing institutional governance here. Border control, document issuance, electoral rolls. This is not about attacking local residents or pointing fingers at people just living their lives. But those institutional gaps, they have very real, very serious security consequences for the Eastern Sabah security zone. I mean, Sabah has a massive 1,400-kilometer coastline to protect. Remember those missing naval ships we talked about at the very beginning? That delay directly cripples the existing maritime capacity. You combine that with a 2026 investigation into a 26-company military procurement cartel, plus a 2023 case where 5 intelligence officers were busted for allegedly selling operational data to smugglers, and you can see the problem. Diverted funds and internal corruption completely kneecap a region's readiness.
Section 4, the Procurement Fraud Playbook, Unmasking Shell Companies.
Okay, so how exactly does this money vanish in the real world? Let's look at the investigator's playbook. Compare a legitimate contractor to a red flag shell company. On the left, your standard legitimate vendor. They've got a verifiable physical address, real warehouses, a solid track record, and normal bank debt. On the right, your classic shell company, often registered just days before a bid, 0 staff, 0 warehouse space, and suspiciously, no bank loans whatsoever. Why? Because avoiding bank debt means you completely bypass lender due diligence. These are the ghost vendors that auditors are constantly hunting for.
And if you look closely, they use some very specific tactical maneuvers. Things like threshold splitting, basically chopping massive projects into tiny contracts just under the RM 500,000 mark so they don't trigger federal oversight. You'll see perfectly rounded figure transactions with 0 itemization. Suddenly, companies start trading way outside their lane. Or they pull a bait and switch, like historically delivering lower spec tank engines after winning a premium bid. And my personal favorite red flag, interlocking directorships, where supposedly fierce competitors bidding on a contract are literally run by the exact same group of people.
Section 5, Rebuilding Institutional Transparency, the Prescribed Remedies. All right, we've done the autopsy, we've seen the damage. Now, how do we fix it? The report lays out some highly specific remedies. Number 1, resolve that 40% court appeal promptly. Stop kicking the can down the road. Number 2, and this is the big one, publish the audited year-by-year revenue data from 1963 to today. You literally can't fix what you can't measure. 3, don't just suggest it, actually legislate hard ban on active politicians sitting on GLC boards. 4, beef up the local security architecture, support local units like the Sabah Rangers, and lean into community-based intelligence. And finally, number 5, mandate a completely independent audit of historical identity documents.
All of this is synthesized perfectly in this quote from the report's conclusion. The recurring thread through all of this isn't just one comic book villain or one isolated scandal. It is the absence, over decades, of the routine transparency mechanisms that the constitutional design already calls for. It's wild when you think about it. We don't even necessarily need a bunch of sweeping new laws. We just need to start honoring the structural safeguards, the audits, and those 5-year reviews that were built into the Federation from day one.
Which brings us to a really critical question to end on. We've traced the architecture of loss, we've seen the unfulfilled constitutional promises, and we know the real-world impact this has on borders and security. So with all these forensic realities laid completely bare on the table, Will the next decade actually bring systemic compliance and true federal state integrity? Or are we just watching page 1 of another chapter of lost years? Thank you so much for hanging out with me for this explainer. I really hope this autopsy gave you a fresh perspective on how accountability actually functions behind the scenes. Keep questioning everything, and I'll see you next time.